Secondary dominants are chromatic chords in that they use notes from outside the key. So in this example, we're in C major, and the second chord is a secondary dominant. The C sharp does not belong in the chord of C major. So how does this work? It's helpful to think about a circle of fifths and remember that the relationship between a tonic chord and the chord of fifth above it, the dominant, is very strong. This is why the perfect cadence is the strongest, most definite sounding cadence. We call this relationship between 5 and 1 tonic-dominant polarity, and understanding this is at the root of understanding a lot of what goes on in Western tonal music. Part of the reason the perfect cadence is so strong is that we hear the leading note of the key move to the tonic. A leading note is called the leading note because this is exactly what it wants to do, lead to the tonic. We call a note like this a tendency note because it has a strong push in a certain direction. It just wants to go up. The effect of the cadence can be strengthened even further by adding a seventh to chord 5. This is because it also has a tendency, this time to push down so that it moves by step to the third of chord 1. Having these two notes fulfilling their tendencies, and in contrary motion as well, makes this a rock-solid progression. The secondary dominant capitalises on this relationship and uses it to bring in chromatic notes from outside the key to add colour and interest. The word chromatic comes from the word chroma in Greek, meaning colour. The secondary dominant works by using the dominant of a chord from the key that you're in. Let's have a look. Here at the top you can see the chords of C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. At the bottom we have the dominants of each of these chords. So obviously the dominant of chord 1 is just chord 5. Chord 1 is a C major chord, chord 5 is a G major chord. There's nothing chromatic about that, so you would never use chord 5 of 1 as a secondary dominant. However, let's look at the dominant of chord 2. So chord 2 is a D minor chord. The dominant chord of D minor is an A major chord. So here we have in this A major chord a note that is not in the key of C major. We have a C sharp. That's the chromatic note. So we can use chord 5 of 2, so an A major chord, to introduce a C sharp as a chromatic note within the key of C major. If we look at chord 3, that's an E minor chord. The dominant of that is a B major chord. That's even more chromatic because it's got two notes from outside the key of C major. It's got D sharp and F sharp. So chord 5 of 3 is especially chromatic. Chord 5 of 4 is just a C major chord because chord 4 is F major. The dominant of F major is just a C major chord, so there's nothing special about that. That's chord 1 of the key that we're in anyway. However, if you add a seventh to that to make it chord 5/7 of 4, then we're adding a B flat. That B flat is chromatic because it's not in a C major scale. So if you're going to use chord 5 of 4, use chord 5/7 of 4 because then it's actually chromatic. There's some point to it then. Chord 5 in C major is a G chord. The dominant of that is a D chord. So the chromatic note there is F sharp. Chord 5 of 5, a D major chord in this case, is one of the most commonly used secondary dominants. Chord 6 in C major is an A minor chord, and the dominant of that is an E major chord. So yes, that's chromatic. The G sharp is the chromatic note. It is these dominants that are the secondary dominants, working like a mini cadence in a different key. It isn't actually a modulation, it's just a little nod to a different key in order to make sense of the chromatic note. A secondary dominant is always or almost always resolved by going to the chord of which it is the dominant. So 5 of 2 would be followed by 2. Let's have a look at some examples. So in this example, we've got chord 5/7 of 2. So we've got an A7 chord there with the blue box round it. it's the C sharp that doesn't belong to the key of C. So that's the chromatic note. The whole thing behaves like a cadence, a perfect cadence in D. So we're thinking of that C sharp as behaving like a leading note at this point. It really pushes up. The seventh pushes down. So the 5-7 of 2 chord is resolved by going to 2. We haven't modulated from C, we've just introduced this secondary dominant, which is a chromatic chord. Here's another example. Here we're using chord 5-7 of 3, which has got 2 chromatic notes. The F sharp doesn't belong to the key, and neither does the D sharp. So the D sharp is what's behaving like a leading note at this point. This whole thing is behaving like a cadence in E minor. So D sharp is behaving like a leading note. It's pushing up to the E. The 7th, which is the A, is pushing down by step to the 3rd of the E minor chord. So the 5-7 of 3 is resolved by going to 3. We haven't modulated from C. We've just introduced this F sharp and D sharp chromatically and we've done it with this secondary dominant progression in order for it to make sense.